Hey, Min, you're muted.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you very much for attending today's BGC Science Friday meeting. My name is Min Shi, and I'm going to present our work on the law of terrestrial phosphorus limitation in carbon cycle and climate feedbacks. So this slide shows the outline of our presentation. First, I will explain the motivation of this study and give a brief introduction. Then followed by the model and the experiments part. And we will discuss results and conclude them after that. And the last part is acknowledgement. And so the motivation of this study is, it is well known the phosphorus is an essential nutrient for plant growth. So a low this kind of concentration of soil P available to plants will limit the potential of plants to uptake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this effect is called P limitation. And the second, as paper said, more than 43% of the global land is limited by the phosphorus. And only 18% is limited by the nitrogen. And about 39% is nitrogen and P co-limited. This is from the DOS paper to 2020. And then the other paper said, the P limitation may reduce the soil water consumption by 8 to 30% during the wet periods. And thus it will increase the tolerance of the tropical ecosystem to drought. So as the atmosphere CO2 concentration rises, the project climate will become warmer and more extreme. So therefore, it is important to study the law of the phosphorus limitation in carbon cycle and climate feedbacks. And this slides will give a brief introduction. So it is well known that the phosphorus plays an important role in biogeochemical feedbacks. So the schematic flowchart in the left panel shows the interactions between the atmospheric CO2 and the biogeochemical cycles, including the phosphorus cycle. So we can see the atmospheric CO2 has a physiological effects on the biogeochemical cycles and the radiative effect on the climate directly. And the climate will affect the biogeochemical cycles, and the biogeochemical cycles will feedback to climate. The P limitation in the phosphorus cycles will not only limit the net primary productions of the ecosystems, but also will affect the soil microbial activities and leading to the reductions in the soil decomposition rate. And those changes will eventually feedback to the climate. So the science questions that we want to address here are how will the phosphorus and the nitrogen limitation change with the increases in atmospheric CO2 concentration and the surface temperature? And will nitrogen have more constraints over the global carbon cycle in a future climate? What is the law of the terrestrial phosphorus limitation on the global carbon cycle and the carbon climate feedbacks? And this figure shows the N and the nitrogen and the phosphorus limitation map from the DOS 2020 paper. So the plant growth are mainly limited by the P over Amazon, United States, and the Central Africa, and the Southwest Russia, and the South China, and the Southeast Asia, and Australia. And the areas that are majorly limited by the nitrogen are the Central Asia and those northern boreal regions. And in the other regions are co-limited by the nitrogen and the phosphorus. So we can see most of the global land is limited by the phosphorus, about 40-30% based on the DOS paper. So this slide, I want to introduce the model and experiments we are doing now. So we're using the energy X-scale system model from the DOE. This is version 1.1. And we conduct 4 experiments following the protocols of the C4MIP. So with the active BGC model, and Claire also using the same experiment is called 1% CO2 simulation. but yeah, she used a lot of CMIP5 and CMIP6 model, and here we only using the use the easily SM model. So they have the full experiment. One is the PI control, we call it the control. It's a pre-industry control simulation with a non-involving pre-industry conditions. And the 1% CO2 BGC is we call it BGC. The CO2 concentration will increase at 1% per year for the BGC model, while the CO2 concentration keep a pre-industry level for the radiation model. And the 1% CO2 IED, we call it IED, it's similar to the 1% CO2 BGC, but vice versa. And the 1% CO2 is the CO2 concentration increase at 1% per year for the BGC and the radiation models. And the two studies the effects of the phosphorus of the global carbon cycle and the feedbacks. So we simulated the easily SM with the carbon nitrogen and the carbon nitrogen phosphorus coupling for each experiment. So this slide shows the effect of the P limitation on the surface climate. So I choose the differences between the CMP and the CN simulation. So that means CMP minus CN in the relative precipitation, surface temperature, and the evapotranspiration. The relative PRT2 and ET for BGC and IED and for the CMP and the CN simulations are the changes to the controls. So the control values are removed from them. And the top and middle and the bottom rows are the BGC and the IED and the 4 experiments respectively. So the PR differences in the ocean are larger than them in the land, and over land, the large differences in the relative precipitation generally happen in the tropics. And the surface temperature in the CMP simulation significantly differs to those in the CN simulation. And the differences in the relative surface temperature among solid experiments, such as the BGC, IED, and the 4 experiments, are also very large. And the signs of the difference even reverse between the BGC and the IED experiments in the Arctic regions. And the differences in the evapotranspiration are significant over Amazon, Southeast United States, Indonesia, Asian boreal regions, and Australia. So overall, I want to show that the P limitation will cause significant differences in climate at a 19% confidence level in most regions. And this slide also shows the correlation coefficients between the differences in MPP, is between the CMP and the CN simulation, so CMP minus CN, and the differences in the precipitation and the surface temperature. Precipitation is in the top row, and the surface temperature in the bottom row. And for the BGC is the first column of the figure, and the IED experiment is the second column, and the 4 experiment is at the 3rd column. So from the figures, we can see the strong coupling between the P limitation and the climate. So nearly 40 to 80% of the variances in the MPP difference between the CMP and the CN can be explained by those variants of the climate variables differences. And the regions with the high correlation generally coincided with the regions in which P is the main limitation factor. And for correlations with precipitation, there are positive correlations over most land area except over Indonesia. For the correlations with temperature, the positive correlation in boreal region indicates that the increase in temperature can accelerate soil decomposition rate and promote the plant growth. And in the IED experiment, that means in the 2nd column, so due to the strong CO2 feedbacks to the climate, that means the strong increase in surface temperature, the stronger and the wider correlation can be seen in such experiment. And in the 4 experiment, the correlation is generally in the middle of the IED and the BGC experiments. So this slide shows the time evolution of the cumulative MPP. Please note that in the 1% CO2 simulation, the atmosphere CO2 concentration also increases in a rate of 1%. So in the figure, we also marked the year when the atmospheric CO2 concentration is twice and the 4 times the pre-industrial values. And we denote this, they are 2 times CO2 and 4 times CO2, respectively hereafter. So this figure is the difference between the CMP and the CN simulations. So due to the P limitation, the NPP in the CMP simulations for the solid experiment are generally less than those in the CN simulation before CO2 atmospheric CO2 concentration reaches the 2 times CO2. And in the IED experiments, so after 2 times CO2, the NPP in the CMP simulation actually is larger than those in the CN simulation. So among the solid experiments, the IED experiments have the smallest P limitation, and the 4 experiments experience the largest P limitation. So why? So I think the possible reason is in the IED experiments. So due to the increases in the surface temperature, the soil generally is very dry, and which will increase the nitrogen and P limitation a lot when the CO2 concentration rises. And compared with the CN simulation, the P limitation will cause the increases in the soil moisture in the CMP simulation because due to the P limitation, reduce the NPP and then reduce the leaf field index and will increase the soil moisture. So the wet soil will accelerate the soil carbon decomposition and get more mineral nitrogen and P available to plants. So this feedback actually will lead to increases in NPP, then it will increase leaf field index, and increases in leaf field index will increase the evapotranspiration. And then evapotranspiration increase will increase the precipitation, and then the soil moisture. So which also triggers the positive soil moisture, evapotranspiration, and the precipitation feedback. So we call the whole this kind of feedback, the P limitation soil moisture feedback. And why the P limitation is strongest in the fall simulation? This is a surprise. I suppose it should be the BGC experiment. Because due to the CO2 fertilization effects, in this experiment, plant demands more soil P and lead to the large P limitation. But the reason is that in the BGC experiment, there's no climate feedback, or we can neglect it in this study. So soil is wetter than that in the fall experiment. So I think the increased temperature is good to the soil decomposition in the fall experiment, but the dry soil cause a decrease in soil decomposition a lot, and as a result, the P limitation increases. And this slide shows the GPP difference is also a CMP minus CN. And so we can see in the IED, in the radiative carpet experiment, GPP is significantly increased in the CMP simulation after year 70. This is around the atmospheric CO2 concentration close to the 2 times CO2. So the possible reason is still that the high demand of water caused by the increases in surface temperature due to enhanced atmospheric CO2 concentration. The P limitation reduced the AOI and then reduced the evapotranspiration, hence increase the soil moisture, which in turn increase the soil carbon decomposition rate and reduce both the nitrogen and the P limitation, not only the P limitation. So it's resulting in the GPP increases in the IED experiment. So besides these feedbacks, due to the direct effect of the P limitation, the reduction in LY and the constraints in the soil decomposition in the CMP simulation will lead to the less GPP and NPP. So before the doubling CO2, the direct effect seems plays a larger role compared with the P limitation soil moisture feedback. But after that, especially due to the significant increase in the surface temperature, both in the FOR and the ID experiments. The feedbacks play a large role. So we get the increases in GPP for the ID and the FOR experiment after 2 times CO2. And for the BGC and the FOR experiments, so due to the CO2 fertilization lead to more demand of nitrogen and the phosphorus. So the direct effect of the P limitation generally causes less GPP in the CN simulation compared with the CN simulation. And this is a heterotrophic soil respiration. So it is directly correlated with the soil carbon deposition rate. So as we discussed in the previous slides, the increases in the heterotrophic respiration in the CMP simulations in the ID experiments are mainly due to the reduction in the evapotranspiration and the increase in soil moisture and trigger an increase in the soil decomposition and triggers this kind of P limitation and the soil moisture feedback. And for the BGC and the FOR experiment, the direct effect of the P limitation causes less heterotrophic respiration, but the P limitation in the FOR experiment is larger than in the BGC experiment. This is because, as we said in the previous slide, the dry soil decreases the soil carbon decomposition. And this slide shows the autotrophic respiration. So before the 2 times CO2, the autotrophic respiration reduced due to the direct effect of the P limitation. And after 2 times CO2, the autotrophic respiration increased generally due to the increase of temperature. So this we can clearly see this is for the net ecosystem exchange. So this also we can see those kind of P limitation and the P limitation and soil moisture feedbacks effects in those 3 experiments. And this is for the soil carbon. So this slide shows shows soil carbon. It also supports our previous finding. So the direct effect of the P limitation causes the reductions in soil carbon in BGC and FOR experiments. But in the ID experiment, due to the P limitation soil moisture feedbacks, the soil carbon is larger in the CN simulation than those in the CN simulation when the soil dries out due to the rise of the temperature. And so this figure shows this kind of the feedbacks we identify in our previous slides. So the P limitation will reduce the MPP and then cause the less leaf area index. And the less leaf area index will cause less evapotranspiration, which will lead to the increase in soil moisture. The wet soil will accelerate the soil carbon decomposition rate. It will reduce not only the P limitation, but also the N limitation. So in turn, the reductions in N and P limitations lead to the increase in MPP and AOI. And the precipitation may increase due to the enhanced evapotranspiration from the increases in leaf area index. Then the positive precipitation soil moisture evapotranspiration feedbacks is triggered. So we can see the P limitation soil moisture feedbacks plays an important role in the ID experiment in the global statistics, where it play a role in the BGC and the FOR experiment in the regional scale. So we anticipate that the feedback also exists in the BGC and the FOR experiment in the regional scale. So the following slide shows the geographically distributed map. So the slide shows the comparison of the difference in MPP between the CMP and the CN simulation. It's a CMP minus a CN. And the average in the 10 years centered on the year when atmospheric CO2 concentration reaches twice its pre-industrial value. And we denote it's 2 times CO2. And the left, this is in the left panel, and in the right panel, it's for the 4 times CO2. So when the atmospheric CO2 concentration is at 2 times CO2, we see that the MPPs are reduced due to the direct effect of the P limitation over central and the southeastern Amazon and the Asian boreal regions. However, there are some regions in which MPPs in the CMP simulation are larger than those in the CN simulation. This is maybe due to the complex interaction between the biosphere and the climate, but we still can using the P limitation and the soil moisture feedbacks to explain it, especially for the IED and the 4 experiments over the tropics. When CO2 rises from the 2 times CO2 to the 4 times CO2, there are more areas with the positive MPP differences because the P limitation and the soil moisture feedbacks plays a more important role when the soil becomes dry with the increases in CO2. And for the BGC experiment, since the climate won't be affected much by the CO2 concentration, so the direct effect of the P limitation plays a more important role than the P limitation soil moisture feedback as a CO2 fertilization. So as the CO2 fertilization will demand more kind of soil P and leading to the stronger P limitation. Therefore, we see more areas in which the MPPs are less in the CMP simulation than so in the CN simulation at 4 times CO2. And this is for the leaf adding because it's similar to the previous results, but due to time limit, I want to skip it. It's just to support our hypothesis. And this is the soil moisture. So as we expected, the soil moisture is wetter in the CMP simulation compared with the CN simulation over the Amazon in both the IED and the 4 experiments, especially at the 4 times CO2. This is because the P limitation and the soil moisture feedback. And this is for the web transpiration is very consistent to the soil moisture results. And this slide shows the limitation factors for plant growth. And it's in the model they called FPG for the CMP and the CN simulations. And their difference is the CMP minus CN. And the figures in ABC are the 10 years averages of the FPG for the CMP and the CN simulations, and their difference respectively. And centered on the year when CO2 reaches twice its pre-industrial value. And the figure CDF is the same, but for the atmospheric CO2 concentration reaches 4 times CO2. So there are many figures here. So, and I just want to make some key point here. So the N limitation will increase over the boreal regions, East Asian and the most area of the United States and the southern coast areas of Australia, while decreases in the Africa, Central US, and the Central American, Northern Australia, and Amazon. And the magnitudes of the changes in the N limitation between the 4 times CO2 and the 2 times CO2 seems larger in CMP simulation compared with the CN simulation. And compared with the CN simulation, the N limitation is largely reduced in the tropical region, including the southeastern Amazon, Africa, and Indonesia, and a narrow band over the boreal region. But slightly increase over Australia, Central US, and Amazon at 2 times CO2. So when CO2 reaches the 4 times pre-industrial value, there are more this kind of area with reductions in N limitations in the CMP simulation, including the Amazon and Australia. And the N limitation gets further declined over the area with reduced N limitation at 2 times CO2. So these results further support the P limitation and the soil moisture feedbacks. The P limitation soil moisture feedbacks causes the less N limitation in the CMP simulation because of the increase in soil moisture. And with the increases in CO2 concentration over the tropics, the reductions in the N limitation in the CMP simulation are larger than those in the CN simulation. It also indicates the effect of the feedback. And this is similar to the above slides, but this is the N limitation for microbial decomposition. So compared with the N limitation for the plant growth, the magnitudes of the changes of the N limitation for microbial decomposition are larger. And however, their patterns are very similar. So the N limitation is reduced over Amazon, Africa, and the Central US, but enhanced over the most area of the boreal region. And this slide shows the P limitation factor for the plant growth and the microbial decomposition on the left and the right panels, respectively. So figure A and B are the 10 years average of the FPG and FPI, centered on the year when CO2 reaches twice its pre-industrial value. And the figure C and D are the same, but for the 4 times CO2. And the figure E and F is their difference. So when the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rises from the 2 times CO2 to the 4 times CO2, the P limitation for plant growth does not change much. So the P limitation in the Central Africa and the Boreal region slightly increase. So that means it's a negative difference. And there is a slightly decline in the southeastern Amazon. So it is a positive difference. So however, the P limitation for microbial decomposition is greatly reduced on land globally, especially in the tropical regions when the CO2 concentration rises from the 2 times CO2 to the 4 times CO2. So considering the changes in the N limitation with the increased CO2 in the above slides, so we anticipated that the N limitation will be more dominant factor in the future in the most area of the Boreal regions, East Asia, and the most area of the US and the southern Australia coastal regions and the southern Argentina. So see the conclusion. So the feedbacks of the P limitation to climate are significant, and so the second is 40 to 80% of the variance of the MPP difference can be explained by the difference in the climate variables. And the P limitation is strongest in the 4 experiment and the weakest in the BGC experiment. And the N limitation will be the more dominant factor in the future in the most area of the Boreal region, East Asia, and the most area of the US, and the southern coastal area of Australia and the southern Argentina. And the P limitation becomes weaker globally in the future due to the P limitation soil moisture feedback. So the global carbon uptake still decreased due to the direct effect of the P limitation. The P limitation soil moisture feedback plays an important role when the soil dries out with the increases in the atmospheric CO2. So it will lead to the more carbon uptake in some dry regions. This feedback is particularly important in the tropics as the soil is expected to be drier with the CO2 rising. And then this research is supported by Rubis project, and I want to thank ESOL team, and especially the ESOL biogeochemical cycles group for their significant contribution to make it available, and also I thank Ming Kwan and Jim for their helpful discussion. Yes, that's all.